Cultural turn in translation. The cultural turn in translation studies marks a shift from viewing translation merely as a linguistic process to understanding it as a cultural activity. Key considerations include influence of culture, how cultural contexts and norms influence the translation process. Power dynamics, the role of power relations between cultures in shaping translations. Interdisciplinary approaches, incorporating insights from anthropology, sociology, and cultural studies into translation theory. 2. The politics of translation. This topic explores how translation is influenced by political agendas and power structures. Key points include ideological manipulation, how translations can be used to promote specific ideologies. Censorship and control, the role of censorship in shaping what gets translated and how. Resistance and subversion, how marginalized groups use translation to resist dominant narratives. 3. The status of languages in the process of translation. This topic addresses the hierarchical status of languages and its impact on translation. Key aspects include dominant versus minority languages, the challenges and implications of translating between dominant and minority languages. Language prestige and accessibility, how the perceived prestige of a language affects its translation and accessibility. Linguistic imperialism, the historical and ongoing effects of linguistic imperialism on translation practices. 4. Postcolonial translation. Postcolonial translation examines the role of translation in the context of colonization and its aftermath. Key considerations include translation and nation building, how translation has been used in the construction of national identities in postcolonial contexts. Case studies from India and other colonies, specific examples of how translation has influenced cultural and political landscapes in former colonies. Orientalist bend in translation, the impact of Orientalist perspectives on the translation of classical texts, often resulting in distortions or misrepresentations. Suggested case studies and examples. India, the role of translation in shaping modern Indian languages and literature during and after British colonial rule. Examples include the translation of Sanskrit texts by British Orientalists and the post-independence translation efforts to promote regional languages. Africa, the translation of African oral literature and its impact on the preservation and transformation of cultural narratives. Latin America, the translation of indigenous texts and the influence of Spanish colonization on local languages and literature. Key thinkers and texts. Lawrence Venuti, his works on the invisibility of the translator and the ethics of translation. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, her essays on the politics of translation and postcolonialism. Susan Bassnett and Harish Trivedi, their edited volume, Postcolonial Translation, Theory and Practice. Conclusion. Each of these topics reveals how translation is far more than a linguistic exercise, it is deeply embedded in cultural, political, and ideological frameworks. Analyzing translation through these lenses allows for a more nuanced understanding of its impact on societies and the continuous interplay between language, power, and identity. Cultural turn in translation. Main arguments. Translation is a cultural act. Translation involves not only linguistic transfer but also cultural interpretation and negotiation. Translators must be sensitive to cultural contexts and the implicit meanings embedded in the source text. Power relations. The cultural turn highlights the power dynamics between source and target cultures, often revealing asymmetries where dominant cultures exert influence over how texts are translated and perceived. Interdisciplinary insights. Incorporating perspectives from anthropology, sociology, and cultural studies, the cultural turn encourages a holistic understanding of translation as a complex cultural phenomenon. Example. Translation of Shakespeare's works. When translating Shakespeare into non-English languages, translators must navigate cultural references, idiomatic expressions, and historical contexts. For instance, translating Hamlet's famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be," into Japanese requires careful consideration of cultural and philosophical differences in the conception of existence and death. 2. The politics of translation. Main arguments. Ideological manipulation. Translations can be manipulated to promote specific political or ideological agendas, often reflecting the biases of those in power. Censorship and control. Governments and institutions may censor translations to control the flow of information and maintain ideological conformity. Resistance and subversion. Translators and marginalized groups can use translation to resist dominant narratives and assert their own voices and perspectives. Example: censorship in Soviet Union translations. During the Soviet era, translations of Western literature were often heavily censored or altered to align with communist ideologies. George Orwell's 1984 was translated in a way that downplayed its criticism of totalitarian regimes, demonstrating the control exerted by the state over translation. 3. The status of languages in the process of translation. Main arguments. Dominant versus minority languages. The status of a language affects its visibility and the quality of its translations. Dominant languages are often privileged over minority languages, which can lead to the marginalization of certain cultures. Language prestige and accessibility. Languages with higher prestige are more likely to be translated and disseminated, impacting global cultural exchange and accessibility. Linguistic imperialism. The historical dominance of certain languages, such as English, has lasting effects on translation practices and language hierarchies. Example: translation of indigenous languages in Latin America. Many indigenous languages in Latin America have been marginalized, with Spanish and Portuguese taking precedence. Efforts to translate indigenous texts, like the Popol Vuh a.k.a. Maya creation narrative, into Spanish and English aim to preserve and disseminate these cultures, but often face challenges due to the lower status of the source language. 4. Postcolonial translation. Main arguments. Translation and nation building. In postcolonial contexts, translation has played a crucial role in shaping national identities and cultural narratives. It can either reinforce colonial legacies or help construct new, independent identities. Case studies from India and other colonies. Examining specific instances of translation in former colonies reveals how translation practices were influenced by colonial powers and how they evolved post-independence. Orientalist bend in translation. Orientalist approaches to translation often exoticize and misrepresent non-Western texts, perpetuating stereotypes and colonial attitudes. Example: translation of Indian texts by British Orientalists. During British colonial rule, scholars like William Jones translated classical Indian texts such as the Manusmriti and the Bhagavad Gita. While these translations introduced Indian literature to the West, they often reflected Orientalist biases and served colonial interests by framing Indian culture as ancient and unchanging, justifying colonial rule as a civilizing mission. Conclusion. Each of these arguments underscores the complex interplay between translation, culture, politics, and power. By examining specific examples, we can see how translation is not a neutral act but one deeply embedded in broader cultural and political contexts. This understanding allows us to appreciate the nuances and implications of translation practices in various settings. Cultural turn in translation. Main arguments. Translation is a cultural act. Translation involves understanding and conveying cultural nuances. It's not merely a word-for-word substitution but a process of cultural adaptation. Power relations. Translations often reflect the power dynamics between cultures, with dominant cultures imposing their values on the translated text. Interdisciplinary insights. By drawing from various fields, the cultural turn encourages a more comprehensive understanding of the socio-cultural context of translations. Examples: Harry Potter. Translations. The Harry Potter series has been translated into numerous languages, each adaptation reflecting cultural differences. For example, in the French version, Hogwarts houses retain their original names, while in the American version, some British terms are altered to be more understandable to American readers, e.g., sherbet lemon becomes lemon drop. The Three Musketeers. In Japan, when Alexander Dumas' The Three Musketeers was translated into Japanese, cultural references and historical contexts were adapted to make the story more relatable to Japanese readers, highlighting how translators navigate cultural specificity. 2. The politics of translation. Main arguments. Ideological manipulation. Translations can be deliberately altered to fit political ideologies, promoting certain viewpoints while suppressing others. Censorship and control. Governments and institutions may restrict translations to maintain control over information and prevent dissent. Resistance and subversion. Translation can be a tool for marginalized groups to challenge dominant narratives and assert their cultural identity. Examples. Translations during Francoist Spain. Under Franco's regime, translations were heavily censored to align with nationalist and Catholic ideologies. For example, parts of George Orwell's works that critiqued totalitarianism were altered or omitted. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, translated into multiple languages, Adichie's novel about the Biafran War has been used to shed light on post-colonial African history and resist Western-dominated narratives. 3. The status of languages in the process of translation. Main arguments. Dominant versus minority languages. Dominant languages are often prioritized in translation, marginalizing minority languages and cultures. Language prestige and accessibility. Prestigious languages receive more attention in translation, influencing what literature becomes accessible globally. Linguistic imperialism. The dominance of certain languages due to historical and political reasons affects translation practices and perpetuates inequalities. Examples. Translations of African literature. Many African literary works are translated from local languages to English or French, often by Western translators, which can influence how African cultures and narratives are perceived globally. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart was translated into numerous languages, but the English version is often the most widely read and studied. Endangered languages. Efforts to translate and document texts in endangered languages, such as the Cherokee language, highlight the challenges and importance of preserving linguistic diversity. Translations of traditional stories and cultural texts play a crucial role in maintaining and revitalizing these languages. 4. Postcolonial translation main arguments. Translation and nation building. In postcolonial societies, translation is integral to constructing national identity and reclaiming cultural heritage. Case studies from India and other colonies. Examining translation practices in specific postcolonial contexts reveals how translation has been used to assert independence and resist colonial legacies. Orientalist bend in translation. Orientalist translations often distort non-Western texts to fit Western stereotypes, impacting how these cultures are understood. Examples. Rabindranath Tagore's works. Tagore's Bengali works, including Gitanjali, were translated into English during British colonial rule, often with an Orientalist slant. Tagore himself translated many of his poems, ensuring they maintained their original spirit and resisting Orientalist distortions. Postcolonial Africa. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a prominent Kenyan writer, advocates for writing and translating literature in indigenous languages. His decision to write in Gikuyu and then translate his works into English exemplifies resistance against colonial linguistic dominance and promotes cultural preservation. Edward Said's Orientalism. Said's analysis of how Western translators and scholars have historically distorted and misrepresented Eastern cultures provides a critical framework for understanding the impact of Orientalist translations. For instance, the translation of classical Persian poetry by Western scholars often emphasized exoticism and mysticism, neglecting other dimensions of the texts. Conclusion. Expanding on these arguments with additional examples reinforces the complexity and significance of translation in cultural and political contexts. Each example illustrates how translation is not a neutral act but one deeply embedded in broader socio-cultural and political frameworks, influencing perceptions, identities, and power relations. This deeper understanding highlights the importance of critically examining translation practices and their impact on global cultural exchange. Cultural turn in translation. Main arguments. Translation is a cultural act. In India, translation often involves negotiating between vastly different cultural contexts, including numerous regional languages and dialects. Power relations. India's colonial history has influenced the power dynamics in translation, with English often positioned as the dominant language. Interdisciplinary insights. Translation in India benefits from incorporating perspectives from anthropology, history, and cultural studies to better understand its socio-cultural implications. Examples. Translating ancient texts. Translating Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharata and Ramayana into regional languages involves not just linguistic transfer but also cultural adaptation. Each regional version reflects local traditions and interpretations. Modern Indian literature. Works of contemporary authors like Ruskin Bond, who writes in English but whose works are translated into Hindi and other regional languages, reflect cultural nuances that resonate differently with diverse audiences. 2. The politics of translation. Main arguments. Ideological manipulation. Translation in India has been used to promote specific ideologies, especially during and after the colonial period. Censorship and control. Various governments in India have used translation as a tool for censorship, particularly when it comes to politically sensitive materials. Resistance and subversion. Translators and writers often use translation to challenge dominant narratives and assert regional or marginalized identities. Examples. Translations during the British Raj. British colonialists translated Indian texts to fit their narrative of India as a land needing British civilization. For instance, translations of the Arthashastra were used to justify colonial rule by emphasizing the need for strong governance. Censorship in post-independence India. Certain works, like Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, faced bans and censorship. Translations of such works into regional languages are often scrutinized and restricted to control dissent and maintain social harmony. Dalit literature. Translation of Dalit literature into mainstream languages serves as a form of resistance. For example, the translation of Bauma's Kurukku from Tamil to English helped bring Dalit experiences and struggles to a wider audience, challenging dominant caste narratives. 3. The status of languages in the process of translation. Main arguments. Dominant versus minority languages. In India, dominant languages like Hindi and English often overshadow regional and minority languages. Language prestige and accessibility. English, being a language of prestige and power, often receives more attention, affecting the accessibility and representation of regional literature. Linguistic imperialism. The historical dominance of English due to colonialism has lasting impacts on translation practices and language hierarchies in India. Examples. Regional literature. Translations of regional works into English can bring wider recognition. For instance, the translation of R.K. Narayan's Malgudi stories from Kannada to English made them accessible globally, but this often overshadows the original language and its nuances. Endangered languages. Efforts to translate works from endangered languages like Kodava or Tulu aim to preserve these languages. However, these translations often struggle to gain the same attention as those from more dominant languages. 4. Post-colonial translation. Main arguments. Translation and nation building. Post-independence, translation has been crucial in building a unified national identity while respecting regional diversities. Case studies from India. Examining specific translation efforts in India reveals how translation has been used to assert independence and cultural pride. Orientalist bend in translation. Orientalist translations of Indian classical texts have often distorted their meanings, impacting global perceptions of Indian culture. Examples. Rabindranath Tagore's translations. Tagore's own translations of his works, like Gitanjali, into English allowed him to control how his poetry was perceived internationally, resisting Orientalist distortions. His Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913 helped highlight Indian literature globally. Translations of classical texts. British translations of texts like the Bhagavad Gita often exoticized and mystified Indian philosophy. Post-independence translations aim to correct these perspectives and present these texts more accurately. Indian epics in regional languages. Translating epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana into various regional languages has played a role in nation building by fostering a sense of shared heritage while allowing for regional interpretations and expressions. Conclusion. In the Indian context, translation is a complex and dynamic process deeply influenced by historical, cultural, and political factors. By examining translation through these lenses, we can understand its role in shaping national identity, preserving linguistic diversity, and challenging power structures. This exploration underscores the importance of critically analyzing translation practices to appreciate their broader cultural and political implications. Cultural turn in translation. Main arguments. Translation is a cultural act. In India, with its rich tapestry of cultures, translation requires a deep understanding of the cultural contexts and nuances of both the source and target languages. Power relations. Historically, colonialism and post-colonial dynamics have shaped translation practices, often prioritizing English over regional languages. Interdisciplinary insights. By integrating insights from various disciplines, translations can more accurately reflect the cultural contexts and complexities of Indian literature. Examples. Translating folklore. translating Indian folklore and oral traditions, such as the Panchatantra or Jataka tales, involves more than linguistic conversion. These texts are steeped in cultural symbolism and moral lessons that need to be preserved and conveyed effectively. Translating Indian cinema. The translation, subtitling and dubbing of Bollywood films into various regional languages showcases how cultural references, humor, and idiomatic expressions are adapted to resonate with diverse audiences across India. 2. The politics of translation. Main arguments. Ideological manipulation. Translation has been used to propagate ideological narratives, both during the colonial period and in independent India. Censorship and control. The political climate often dictates which works are translated and how they are presented to the public. Resistance and subversion. Translators and writers use translation to resist dominant ideologies and give voice to marginalized communities. Examples. Translation during the emergency. During the emergency period 1975–77 in India, translations of political literature were closely monitored and censored to prevent dissent. Works critical of the government faced heavy censorship or were banned altogether. Translating Dalit literature. Translating works of Dalit writers such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar or Tamil writer P. Sivakami into English and other regional languages has been a form of resistance against caste oppression. These translations help in spreading the message of social justice and equality. Controversial translations. The translation of Wendy Doniger's The Hindus, An Alternative History, faced backlash and led to its withdrawal in India due to its controversial interpretation of Hindu texts, highlighting how translations can become political battlegrounds. 3. The status of languages in the process of translation. Main arguments. Dominant versus minority languages. The status of English and Hindi as dominant languages often marginalizes regional and minority languages in translation practices. Language prestige and accessibility. The prestige associated with English affects the visibility and accessibility of translated works. Linguistic imperialism. The colonial legacy of English dominance continues to influence translation practices and language hierarchies in India. Examples. Translation of regional classics. The translation of regional classics like Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay's Bengali novels Devdas into Hindi and English has helped bring regional literature to a broader audience, though often at the cost of diluting cultural nuances. Endangered languages. Efforts to translate and document texts in endangered languages, such as Kashmiri or Manipuri, are crucial for preserving linguistic diversity. However, these translations often struggle for recognition compared to works in dominant languages. Multilingual education. In India's multilingual educational system, textbooks are often translated from English or Hindi into regional languages. This process highlights the challenges and biases in preserving the original text's integrity and making education accessible across linguistic barriers. 4. Postcolonial translation. Main arguments. Translation and nation building. In postcolonial India, translation has been pivotal in shaping national identity and reclaiming cultural narratives. Case studies from India, examining specific instances of translation efforts in India reveals the impact of translation on cultural revival and resistance against colonial legacies. Orientalist bend in translation. Orientalist translations by colonial scholars often misrepresented Indian texts, necessitating post-colonial retranslations to correct these distortions. Examples. Translating Nehru's works. Jawaharlal Nehru's writings, such as The Discovery of India, have been translated into various Indian languages, playing a significant role in nation building by fostering a sense of unity and shared history. Retranslations of classical texts. Postcolonial retranslations of texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads aim to correct Orientalist biases and present these works from an Indian perspective. For example, the translations by Eknath Easwaran and Swami Sivananda provide interpretations rooted in Indian philosophical traditions. Indian epics in regional languages. Translating epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata into regional languages has played a role in nation building by fostering a sense of shared heritage while allowing for regional interpretations and expressions. Conclusion. In the Indian context, translation is a multifaceted process deeply intertwined with cultural, political, and historical dynamics. By Examining translation practices through these lenses, we can appreciate the complexities involved and the significant role translation plays in shaping cultural identities, preserving linguistic diversity, and challenging power structures. This expanded understanding highlights the critical importance of translation in fostering cultural dialogue and promoting social justice in a diverse and multilingual nation like India. The greatest translated works of world literature are those that have transcended their original languages and made a significant impact on global culture. Here are some of the most influential translated works. Classical literature. Homer's The Iliad and The Odyssey. Original language, Ancient Greek. Impact. These epic poems have been translated into numerous languages and have profoundly influenced Western literature, philosophy, and art. Virgil's Aeneid. Original language, Latin. Impact. This epic poem is a cornerstone of Roman literature and has been widely translated, shaping the literary traditions of many cultures. Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. Original language, Italian. Impact. This epic poem, particularly Inferno, has been translated into many languages and has significantly influenced Western literary and theological thought. Modern literature. Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Original language, Russian. Impact. This novel is one of the greatest works of world literature and has been translated into many languages, offering profound insights into human nature and history. Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Original language, Russian. Impact. This psychological novel has been translated widely, deeply influencing the genre of psychological fiction and modern existential thought. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Original language, Spanish. Impact. This novel has been translated into dozens of languages and is considered one of the defining works of magical realism, influencing global literature. Poetry. Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. Original language, Persian. Impact. The English translation by Edward Fitzgerald has brought these quatrains to global attention, highlighting Persian literary traditions. Pablo Neruda's 20 Love Poems and a Song of Despair. Original language, Spanish. Impact. These poems have been translated into numerous languages, establishing Neruda as a major figure in world poetry. Philosophical and religious texts. The Bible. Original language, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. Impact. The Bible is the most translated book in the world, with profound religious, cultural, and literary influence globally. The Quran. Original language, Arabic. Impact. The Quran has been translated into many languages, profoundly impacting religious thought and practice worldwide. Confucius's The Analects. Original language, Classical Chinese. Impact. These teachings have been translated into numerous languages, deeply influencing East Asian culture and philosophy. Modern philosophy and critical theory. Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. Original language, French. Impact. This existentialist work has been translated widely, influencing modern philosophy and existential thought. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Original language, French. Impact. This foundational feminist text has been translated into many languages, significantly impacting feminist theory and gender studies. Postcolonial and contemporary literature. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Original language, English. Impact. Though originally in English, it has been translated into numerous languages, providing critical insights into African cultures and postcolonialism. Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood. Original language, Japanese. Impact. This novel has been translated into many languages and has brought contemporary Japanese literature to a global audience. Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red. Original language, Turkish. Impact. This novel has been widely translated, offering insights into Ottoman culture and history while influencing contemporary world literature. Conclusion. These works, among others, highlight the transformative power of translation in bringing diverse literary traditions to a global audience. Translation not only makes literature accessible to a broader readership but also fosters cross-cultural understanding and appreciation.